confuses me. What the points according to the document, the J-Rocks to solve their paraphrase.
Haven't you ever heard of a killer?
Use these ERBs to go back in time.
So I said, look at LeakYou video. What the fuck is LeakYou? Is it like a site? What's LeakYou? LeakYou. Is it a YouTube channel? Oh shit. Oh, all right, bet. Here we go.
Please hit the like. Thank you.
One, two, three, four.
Man, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Shout out to you all. Oh my God, is that Gloria over there on Twitter? Hold on, Gloria. Since you're there, let me mod you over there. I've been needing a moderator over there for a minute. I've been growing my Twitter audience pretty crazily, and it's amazing. And you'll see as you're there with your own eyes how people are going to just start coming in. We may mess around and have a couple hundred viewers over there within a matter of a few minutes. But listen, this is a really important situation that we need to talk about. Shout out to Khalil Pork Bellies in the building as well. We have a pretty serious situation. And ooh, Gloria, you know what? I hate to tell you this, but I got to kill that stream you're over on now. Hold on. Because my hashtags did not go through. So listen, I'm going to kill the Twitter stream and I'm going to restart it. So watch it. Just watch. It'll come back with the hashtags. I need those hashtags to be there. It's important. So you all give me a minute. We're going to get it together here, but watch the live stream notifications. I'm about to be live right again. Gloria on Twitter. All right. You all forgive me. We've got, I've got a little technical difficulties. You've got to do the StreamYard setup exactly perfect when you do the Twitter config. And so if you don't do it perfectly, exactly right, the hashtag, essentially, I'm not going to explain it, but you have to make sure that you set it up right. And we should now be back live on Twitter. So I'm expecting to see Gloria coming back right on in. But listen, guys, let me get to this and talk about what is going on. That is, very important. And for some reason, hold on, guys, because I got to get this together here. Hold on. Gloria, it still didn't go through like I wanted it to. That is so weird, but I gotta kill it, and, I'll be right back. Sorry. If it doesn't work this 3rd time, then I won't worry about it. Y'all, sorry about the technical difficulties, but, um, I'm very specific about how I like to do my streams, so I wanna fix this. So give me a second, please. Thank you. Okay, let's try this. Now, if it doesn't work this 3rd time, if it doesn't work for the 3rd time, I'm just starting the stream back on Twitter. If it doesn't work this 3rd time like I want it to, then I won't even worry about it because people are coming in. But I have specific things that I do, um, and so hopefully, I'm just making sure we're getting back online here on Twitter. I see you all piling in. Give me a sec, y'all. We're gonna get it together. We've got some astronauts stranded in space. There we go. It went through that time. All right. There we go. Thank you, Gloria. Thank you, my darling. Let me go on in there and I will get you modded up here momentarily, but let me start the discussion here, the commentary. And so we can talk about what's happening right now that we've talked about quite a few times before. Yeah, there we go. I see y'all coming in. You see how the difference is when you set it up right. You see people just piling in. There we go. All right. I'll get you modded up here momentarily, Gloria. Shout out to you. Thanks for showing up there on X. Guys, we have some astronauts that have been stranded in space. These two individuals, Butch and Sunny, are becoming quite famous right about now. And they are essentially stranded in space. NASA has been working with Boeing / arguing / very intense conversations have been ongoing between NASA and Boeing regarding the Boeing Starliner, which docked to the International Space Station and essentially has stranded its astronauts. Um, there's a lot of fear about getting these astronauts home safe. And recently, if you all been following, right? Um, there was a piece of audio that it had, occurred. Oh, I want to say about 2 months ago. That was supposedly accidentally streamed live from NASA's live feed, in which you could hear a doctor uh, discussing over the air about a potential crew member that died, right? That it was a medical, they said it was a medical um, reenactment, I guess would be the best word to say, like a medical reenactment of some kind. But essentially, they talked about an astronaut having like decompression sickness and blase, blase, blase. And it scared a lot of people. It scared a lot of people. So you had that happening, right? And what appeared to be a situation really burning regards to two astronauts, Butch and Sunny, who essentially went to space on the Boeing Starliner and essentially have ended up stranded on the International Space Station. And they've been doing everything to try to, qualm this story, to keep it quiet. They're even still saying like, "Oh no, they're not stranded. They're not stranded there." But I would beg a differ. I would absolutely beg a differ with NASA on this, right? So these two astronauts that are currently stuck on the International Space Station, NASA is now saying they will not return back to Earth until next Friday. This is Sunny Williams and Butch Wilmore, who lifted into space on June 5th, 2024 from Cape Canaveral, Florida. And the craft that essentially took them to space has been returned back to Earth sans astronauts. They decided they did not want the astronauts to fly back on this Boeing Starliner. So NASA has astronauts will return next February on a SpaceX crewed Dragon flight. 2 seats have been made available for Miss Sunita Sunny Williams and Barry Butch Wilmore. These astronauts will not return on the craft that brought him into space, which has had problems after the capsule sprang some leaks and some of its thrusters have failed. The space agency is live right now giving an announcement, and they said they did an agency level review that included Bill Nelson, the agency's administrator. NASA has essentially decided that they will return with SpaceX Crew 9 next February, and that the Starliner will continue to remain uncrewed. Isn't that amazing? We've got private space flight happening now in real life emergencies happening out there on the International Space Station. Again, this is after a very cryptic piece of audio was fed from NASA's live feed, where you heard a doctor simulating a decompression situation. Now, there's a lot of talk about Boeing and NASA having some very serious disagreements. And what is being stated is that Boeing has been working with NASA to get all of the necessary data to make the proper decision on whether or not Sonny and Butch were going to return with this Boeing Starliner. This leaves a very bad mark on Boeing, but they've got planes that don't seem to be too safe right about now. And listen, they're putting a lot of resources into this Starliner, which has had a lot of technical problems. NASA, again, as I said, they've had. Let me talk first about the Starliner. 4 of the spacecraft's 5 failed thrusters. 5. 4 of the 5 thrusters have failed at some point in orbit. The thrusters are crucial for the spacecraft to be able to back away from the International Space Station after it undocks and to maintain the capsule in a proper position for deorbit. And again, during this period of time, we've had 4 of 5 fail, right? Boeing said even in a blog post back on August 2nd that they had conducted extensive testing of its propulsion system, both in space and on the ground. And this embattled manufacturer has struggled to compete with SpaceX. It's taken $1.6 billion in losses on the Starliner program. And it looks like they sent a shitty craft, just like they have their shitty planes. It's almost like they sent a shitty craft with 2 souls on board and thrusted them into space. And it's almost like NASA has taken like this, they've done this takeover type of thing. Where they're like, yo, Boeing, no. You're not going to send those souls back on this craft that's had so many technical malfunctions, period. Now, Butch and Sunny are doing well on the International Space Station. They're well engaged. They've got food, everybody. They're eating space food. You know, it is space food because it's food taken up to space. Their food, the food is being shared, right? For the 2 additional astronauts, thank God. And so it's not a situation where we have to, worry about like 2 teams working together up in space. They seem to be getting along just fine. But, it's funny to me in a way that SpaceX, who has been, kind of embattled with Boeing, is actually going to be the one to bring these 2 astronauts home. What a nightmare for Boeing. What an absolute nightmare for Boeing right about now. Oh my gosh. Oh, wow. Anyway, listen, guys. It's crazy how they don't want to say that Butch and Sunny are stranded in space. They are absolutely stranded in space right now. All right. They are stuck in space. They are stuck in space. We have 2 astronauts stuck in space. I want to take a moment to look at the news conference that NASA just did. Well, they're live now, right? Can we take a moment just to look at some parts of this very interesting news conference that just kicked off a few minutes ago? And while we're doing that, I'm going to get Gloria figured out here up on Twitter.
And they demonstrated patience, adaptability, flexibility, resilience, and readiness. That's what you get with an American astronaut. They've been eager to contribute to important conversations. They've asked questions. They seamlessly become part of the Expedition 71 crew, contributing to the important work on board the International Space Station. You know, when you're charting new paths for exploration, there are highs and lows. We all know this. It's part of exploration and moving forward. Space flight is hard. The margins are thin. The space environment is not forgiving. And we have to be right. We all know this. This was a tough problem to be solved, and a decision had to be made. I want you to remember, Starliner is a robust vehicle with excellent flying qualities, as evidenced by the manual demonstration accomplished by Butch prior to docking. And Starliner has performed exceptionally well overall, so please don't lose sight of that. This is a test flight, and the thruster issue and the associated investigations will pay huge dividends in the future for human exploration in a great way when Starliner flies again. I am encouraged by the dedication and resilience both the NASA and Boeing ground teams and, of course, our space flyers exhibit. I talked with Butch and Sunny both yesterday and today. They support the agency's decision fully, and they're ready to continue this mission on board ISS as members of the Expedition 71 crew. I would also be remiss not to mention that this decision also affects the Crew 9 mission and the astronauts that are assigned to fly in that mission in September. Crew 9 mission will now configure Dragon for 2 crew members and will provide seats for Butch and Sunny to return. We're also working to finalize those crew assignments and update the training plan. Those decisions will be made public once they are finalized. I would again like to thank all the teams who have designed, built, and now fly Starliner. Going forward, their hard work will continue to pave the path for expanded human spaceflight exploration. Thanks.
Thanks, Norm. We'll move into the question and answer portion now. We'll open it up again to folks in the room and folks on the phone. If you're on the phone, press *1 to get into the queue. Please clearly state which of our participants you are addressing in your question, and we appreciate you limiting yourself to 1 question. So with that, yeah, in the back.
Mark Strassman, CBS News. This could be for Jim or Ken or Steve. I'll let you decide. My question is about trust. Space flight is a business that's built on trust. You trust that everyone's going to do their job. You have to have trust in all your space partners. Boeing essentially said, trust us. We have a spacecraft that is ready to return astronauts home. And NASA went in a different direction. So how now do you begin to rebuild that relationship of trust with Boeing?
You know, I'll start. I don't think it's a trust issue at all. I don't think we're rebuilding trust. I think we're looking at the data, and we view the data and the uncertainty that's there differently than Boeing does. It's not a matter of trust. It's our technical expertise and our experience that we have to balance. And I think Ken said it. We balance risk across everything, not just the Starliner piece. So I don't see it as a trust issue at all. I guess Ken or Stitch. Yeah.
Well, I would say that we've had a lot of tense discussions, right? Because the call was close, and so people have emotional investment in either option, and that gives you a healthy discourse. But after that, you have to do some work to keep your team together, right? To keep your team restored and ready for the next issue. And I'll acknowledge that we have some work to do there. It's pretty natural whenever you've had a difficult decision to make. But we're aware of it, and we'll work it. And we're committed to continuing to work with Boeing. Steve, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I wouldn't necessarily call it trust. I would call it a technical disagreement where we get a group of engineers together and they disagree on the risk level of what could potentially happen to the thrusters. Boeing did a great job building a model. Now, the question is that model good enough to predict performance for a crew? All the work we've done is really important also for bringing this vehicle back. We want the vehicle to come back uncrewed. It needs to land at the White Sands Space Harbor, which is where the opportunities are setting up in September. And all the work that we've done, both on the NASA and Boeing side, give us confidence to bring the vehicle back. It has to execute a deorbit burn. It has to do all the things we need it to do, undocking from the space station safely. So I think together we have worked toward that part. There's just a little disagreement in terms of the level of risk. And that's kind of where it got down to. And I would say, it's close. It's very close, and it just depends on, how you evaluate the risk. We did it a little differently with our crew than Boeing did.
And Mark, trust is a two-way street, and it's built upon a relationship. And I think, as indicated just an hour ago by the new CEO of Boeing, that they intend to move forward and fly Starliner in the future, which is very important to NASA, that we have two human-rated vehicles. I think you should understand the trust is two ways.
Y'all listening? Ooh, baby.
Ars Technica.
Ooh, baby.
Two questions. One for the administrator, just to follow up on that question about Boeing and your discussion with the Boeing CEO, Kelly Ortberg. How do you anticipate that NASA can help Boeing get Starliner operational missions? Could you maybe fly like a cargo mission to support that, or just curious what your thoughts are on that? And then for, I think, Ken Bowersox, curious, when did you think it was likely that Crew Dragon would be the vehicle to bring the crew home, Butch and Sunny? From the outside, it does seem like that you saw something perhaps in the White Sands test data that gave you concern. It certainly seemed like that's when the odds
Red Wings
for Dragon. Would love any insights on that. Thank you.
Red Wings.
Your question to me is best answered by the people that are going to determine the specific testing and what is required before the crew would fly.
Yeah, I can take a cut at that, Eric. So we're going to sit down with Boeing and kind of lay out what's that path, right? I would say the White Sands testing did give us a surprise. We saw in that testing, as we did, we did 5 total simulations with that thruster of a downhill deorbit burn sequence. And so that's when we saw this swelling of the poppet on the oxidizer side. In other words, a piece of Teflon that swells up and it gets in the flow path and causes the oxidizer to not go into the thruster the way it needs to go into. And that's what caused the degradation of thrust. When we saw that, I think that's when things changed a bit for us, in that now we know that's prevalent, and where is it prevalent in other thrusters, and then what could that swelling do in the future? So that's, I think, where we change course. What we have to do now moving forward for Starliner 1 is how do we avoid firing that thruster in a manner that would cause the heating that causes that oxidizer poppet Teflon piece to swell? Can we figure out how to do that with some testing? And can we also have learned recently that the environment in the doghouse, and I think I've talked about this, is hotter than we thought. In other words, when the other thrusters fire in a doghouse, some of that heat soaks back into an individual thruster, and that causes the Teflon to swell. It also causes some vaporization of the propellant. So is there a way we can figure out how to get the doghouse cooler overall? And then thirdly, we see crosstalk sometimes when an OMAC, the orbital maneuvering engine, the big 1,500 pound thruster fires, it then causes heat on one of the adjacent thrusters. So we've got to sit down and go through all those details with Boeing, with Aerojet. The teams have been so focused over the last couple of months at understanding the physics and what's going on, which we have a much better understanding of that now. Now that we have that understanding of the physics, I think we can move forward and start to find mitigations for future flights. See if Ken has anything to add.
Well, for me, the White Sands results I thought were a gift. It was just great to have that data. And I really thought it might help us convert. I've seen it with a few of our discussions where we have people in different camps on a risk decision. We gather more data, and then a piece of data comes in, and we come together, and everybody agrees that we take one path or the other. And I thought we might get there until probably about a week ago, I'd say. That's where it started looking like, hey, I just don't think we'll get there in time for bringing Starliner home in a timely manner. With more time, we might have gotten a lot smarter, but we're just at the point where we need to bring Starliner home, take all the data we can, and keep moving forward, I think.
Next question is from Marcia Dunn on the phone lines. Marcia Dunn from Associated Press.
Yes, hi. For you, Ken, I'd like a little more information on how the opinions were split. Was it 50-50, 75 to 25% in favor of SpaceX? If you could just characterize the numbers for and against, and also if you could discuss the mood in the room today. Thank you.
The polling was unanimous amongst all the NASA folks. Boeing expressed the ability to either work crewed or uncrewed. They believe in their vehicle and they'd be willing to bring a crew home on it. We had some NASA folks that took a broader view of the global risks, who thought that, hey, we probably should keep the crew on the test flight. To say whether that was 15, 20% of the people, I'd have a hard time coming up with that number. But as far as the mood, all of us really wanted to complete the test flight with crew, and I think unanimously we're disappointed not to be able to do that. But that's part of the reason our system is set up the way it is, right? You don't want that disappointment to weigh unhealthily in your decision. And so on purpose, our system increases the volume on some of our voices from the technical authorities, folks that are asked not to think about those emotions. And it helps to pull you away from the fact that you might be disappointed in a certain decision and then guide you towards that final outcome.
And I would add on the mood in the room, you know, I think everybody is professional and did their jobs, but there is a sense of not accomplishing the mission that we set out to do. And even for myself personally, that is a hard thing to go through. It's a little bit of a situation of loss and feeling like you lost something. And we haven't, in the ultimate long-term view, we have not lost anything, because Boeing, as the administrator Nelson said, is committed to finding the solutions and flying Starliner again. But I probably can't express in words what it's like when you commit to a mission, you've worked on a mission so long, and then we make a fairly dramatic change, which we have not done in human spaceflight in a long time. And so there's a feeling of loss, and we'll work with our team to make sure we talk about that and we move forward from here, because we need this team to focus not only on returning Starliner safely, but we have a Crew 8 mission to return and reconfigure. We have a Crew 9 launch coming up as well, and we need to focus on all those things. We have a really busy time frame, and we'll do that. We'll talk to the team and make sure they understand that it's nobody's fault, and it's a normal feeling to have this feeling of loss, or that you didn't complete what you intended to do.
Okay, we'll take the next question also from the phone lines from Marissa Para from NBC News.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for doing this. Marissa Para with NBC here. Senator Nelson, this could be for you or for anyone else who wants to join in. We heard a mention of a next space flight for Starliner a couple of times, and we know how much NASA would like to have an alternative to SpaceX, more companies available to provide the ability to shuttle astronauts to the ISS. Senator Nelson, how certain are you that Boeing will ever launch Starliner with a crew on board again?
100%.
100%.
Correct.
There is no shadow of a doubt in your mind. Can you explain why?
Because of what this panel has already told you. The extensive cooperative working relationship between NASA and Boeing, of finding the problem, but knowing that the uncertainties are what held up the crew getting on Starliner to go home, and a certainty on my part that we will find out the uncertainty, and Boeing's willingness to carry through on this program.
All right, next question from the phones, Kristen Fisher from CNN.
Thank you. My question is also for Senator Nelson. Senator, you were a member of the congressional committee that investigated the Challenger accident. You were a senator when Columbia happened. How much did that experience influence your personal decision today? Thank you.
Well, very much. It has affected the decision today by this collective group and all of those that participated in the flight test readiness review this morning. It is a trying to turn around the culture that first led to the loss of Challenger and then led to the loss of Columbia, where obvious mistakes were not being brought forth. For example, give you specifics going back to the loss of Challenger. Even the engineers in Utah, in Morton Thiokol, were begging their management not to launch because of the cold weather. And that information never got up. And that was happening on the very night before the launch the next morning. Another example, on Columbia, astronauts would get through with their flights and they'd inspect the orbiter, and they'd, as a matter of fact, my commander, Hoot Gibson, said he'd look at subsequent flights and he would look like that a shotgun had been shot on the delicate silicon tiles because of so much of the foam shedding off of the external tank. But there was a culture that did not bring that information up to the decision makers. So NASA ever since has tried very hard to bring about an atmosphere in which people are encouraged to step forward and speak their mind. And I think right today is a good example of that.
Do we have other questions in the room? Yep.
Wow. Wow.
Good morning, Cheryl Mercedes here with KHOU here in Houston, Texas. Any of you can answer this question. Just really simply state it to the folks at home who have no idea what these two astronauts are experiencing right now up in orbit. All they're hearing is the technical stuff and what we're reporting. What do you have to say to those folks who are saying, man, these guys simply are going to miss out on the holidays with their families at home? What's it like for them up there? What are they experiencing day to day now with this decision and this news that it will now be months before they return? Thank you.
I'll jump in on this one. First off, all the astronauts on station are professionals. All those qualities I talked about with Butch and Sunny, that's exemplified in every astronaut that flies to the International Space Station. They're professionals. When they launch, they know that there are circumstances where they can be on board for up to a year. So mentally, you know that you could be in that situation. Now, once you're in the arena, obviously, it's a little different. It's challenging. It's disappointing that they're not coming home on Starliner, but that's okay. It's a test flight. That's what we do. They knew those risks going in, but we keep them very busy. There's a lot of science and research going on the International Space Station that Dana can elaborate on and has elaborated on. We keep them busy, we keep them working, and they are continuing to pave the road for human exploration going forward. So it's great. They're part of the crew, and they're doing fine.
What do you say to their families?
I care deeply about their families. I know this is a huge impact to their families, and it means a lot. Their families are the pillars that keep them strong. They're the pillars that we at NASA depend on for the workforce to keep us going. They're the pillars that help this team with the crewed flight test have the resilience to keep going, especially over these last 2 months that were needed to go forward. And that's both at NASA and Boeing. So family is the backbone of what we do in the support structure. So I tell their families, thank you. Thank you for their support. Thank you for what they do to allow NASA and our commercial partners to do what we do to explore space.
We're going to go back to the phone lines. Next is Eben Brown from Fox News.
Hi, good afternoon. Eben Brown, Fox News for Administrator Nelson. Sir, I can appreciate all the technical and R&D review here that's being detailed for us, and the investment everyone has in this. But I'd like to ask you about the investment we as taxpayers have given to Boeing over, I think it's at least 15 years now. It's been hundreds of millions from seed money to selecting them as providers for commercial crew. At what point, and I understand this is an oversight issue and it may come from something above the agency, but your career has spanned both the agency and above the agency, and I want to know how or when or what's the process for reviewing this contract to determine we're not getting what we paid for as taxpayers. I say this as knowing that there is a public sentiment that is very skeptical of Boeing as a corporation right now, not just due to this, but also due to their other issues in commercial aviation. So I'd like to know when those discussions happen and how they happen and what gets discussed.
To specifically answer your question, you remember when we started the commercial program, one of the advantages of the commercial program was that it was going to be a fixed price contract. So much of NASA's research and development in a very unforgiving environment, space, that is very hard and is cutting edge technology, and it is very expensive. And as a result, on the normal way of contracting, cost plus, it will run the cost way up. Not so with the commercial crew program. And that was part of the negotiation for both of the companies, Boeing and SpaceX. And they've got a fixed price. And if you check the record, you can find out how much additional Boeing has had to spend. So my answer, you're posturing the question of what I would answer in front of a congressional committee about the cost, is that this program is working like it should. Now, if your question portends something else, then speak it, but I think that's what you were getting at.
Okay, we'll go to Joey Roulette from Reuters.
Thanks. For Bill Nelson, did Kelly Ortberg say when you talked to him whether Boeing would pay for an additional test mission before Starliner gets certified? And for Steve or Ken, I'm reading some contract language from Boeing's most recent modification that says it kind of broadly defines certification as coming after Starliner flies astronauts to and from the ISS. And so I know there's a lot of data that you guys are going to get on the return leg, but since it's coming back empty and based on what we've seen so far, will NASA want to see Boeing fly an additional test mission before it gets its certification, or might NASA change those requirements and certify Starliner anyway?
Joey, it did not come up, nor would it have been appropriate for in a conversation of which I'm alerting him as to what the decision of the flight test readiness review was, that we would get into those matters.
Yeah, we've started looking at the flight test objectives, what we have already accomplished on this flight and what's remaining. We have not, made a total determination yet of what objectives are in front of us or what we've fulfilled. We'll take a little time to do that. I don't think we have decided on the path yet of another crewed flight test. We have gotten a lot out of this vehicle so far. It's been on orbit now for 2.5 months, which we didn't intend. So we've got a lot of data out of that. We'll have to sit down and talk about the certification aspects after the flight. It's a little premature to do that at this point.
Yeah, we need to get the vehicle back on the ground and then analyze the data and be driven by that in our next decision. But I wouldn't rule anything out, right? I mean, we have options for how we move forward. The one thing I do want to emphasize is we plan to work together with Boeing to find that path.
Next, we have Chris Davenport from the Washington Post.
Hi, thanks so much. I guess for Ken Bowersox, I want to follow up on that poll, which you said was unanimous. I wonder if you can give us a number of votes cast that was as part of that poll. Was it like 10-0, 12? How many votes were there? Thank you.
Well, so I'll kind of go through just mentally all the orgs we polled. We unofficially asked the opinion of the NASA Engineering and Safety Center, the Flight Operations Directorate, the Division Director for ISS and Commercial LEO Development at NASA headquarters, the ISS program, the Commercial Crew Program, the Engineering Technical Authority, the Crew Health and Medical Technical Authority, Safety and Mission Assurance Technical Authority. Let's see, who else did I leave out? All the center directors from Stennis, Marshall, JSC, and Kennedy Space Center, where the Commercial Crew Program is officially based. Anybody I missed on that list?
I think you got just about everybody.
I think that I get everybody, and that was again, everybody concurred with proceeding uncrewed, and they stated where they might have one or two people during our meeting that had a different opinion and tried to give those folks an opportunity to talk to the group.
We'll go to Micah Maidenberg from Wall Street Journal.
Thank you. For Administrator Nelson and Jim Free, there was a discussion on a previous call about Starliner returning uncrewed, if that would count as a loss of mission or mission failure. What is your view on that? And if you don't agree that it would be a loss of mission or mission failure, could you please explain why? Thanks.
Yeah, Mike, I think let me go back to echo something Steve said. We've accomplished a lot on this mission and learned a lot about this vehicle, satisfied a lot of the objectives already. That stressed here by Steve, stressed on previous press conferences. We'll look at this as we do any of our missions to see, does it fall into any of the categories that we have that we define as a mishap once we get the vehicle back. That's our time to look at that. So I think that's a question I'd save and pose to us on the other side of getting the vehicle back.
We'll go to Izzy Alvarez from ABC.
Thank you. Can you please tell us in layman terms why NASA chose SpaceX to bring Sunny and Butch home? How did you come to that decision?
I can take a cut at that, and we'll see. When we looked at, first of all, we looked at the risk of putting Butch and Sunny on the Starliner vehicle due to the issues with the thrusters that we've talked about. And so when we looked at that risk, we said that risk was due to the uncertainties, due to the inability to predict with certainty the thruster performance for the rest of the mission, including holding the orientation of the vehicle for the deorbit burn and then maneuvering the vehicle for the separation of the crew module and the service module. When we came to that conclusion, we started looking at what other options, Dana and I both did, what options do we have? because these missions are really jointly shared between the ISS program and Commercial Crew Program. And as we started looking at various options, it was obvious to both of us that the easiest and best option was to configure the Crew 9 vehicle with a couple empty seats on the way uphill to put ballast in those seats. SpaceX had that capability. We also knew that we had a spacesuit on orbit already that we could utilize for one of the crew members. They've tried that on, and that spacesuit works. Both crew members tried on a spacesuit, so we have a spacesuit now we're going to launch for one of the other crew members on Crew 9. And then we really wanted to give the crew, you know, a suited return like we always have in U.S. space flight. So when we started to weigh all those options, it became very obvious that Crew 9 was the best option. Fly up 2 empty seats, have Butch and Sunny join the increment crew and return on Crew 9. That just became the easiest, the best option, and the most efficient option for all of us. And I'll see if Dana has anything to add.
Yeah, I would just add that, you know, knowing that this was a test flight, we made the decision a couple of years ago to train and keep Butch and Sunny current with all aspects of station, some of the most complex things we do, spacewalks, robotics, some of the research. So we had them trained. They've obviously flown to station before. They've done long duration missions, both of them have. And so again, when you line that up with our vehicle options and the fact that the Dragon spacecraft is highly automated, as you all know, we've used it for private astronaut missions. We do have a lot of experience taking people with much less training than what our classic training is for our NASA crew and having them fly on Dragons. And so when you look at that in aggregate, it made a lot of sense to make the decision to adjust Crew 9 and have them do a full expedition and come home on a Dragon.
And one thing I'd like to add, a major goal of the Commercial Crew Program is to develop not just the capability to go back and forth to space station, but a generic capability to go back and forth to low Earth orbit to develop a commercial capability. There's 2 reasons for that. One is dissimilar redundancy. So you have this option where if there's a problem on one vehicle, you might not have the same problem on another vehicle. So you could use them for a return or perhaps keep them flying while another vehicle is working through recovery from some sort of a problem. But it's also to provide some competition in the environment, and competition is healthy in a lot of ways. It causes you to develop your technology. It causes you to get better pricing, and we would like to have that competition in the future. So that's why we have more than one provider we're trying to develop.
Next question is from Kenneth Chang from the New York Times.
Hi, thank you. This is, I guess, is for Administrator Nelson. You expressed confidence that Boeing will continue, but it's also a fixed price contract, so potentially they could lose. They've already written up $1.6 billion. Are you saying that you're confident that they will continue to write off money, losing money on this? And I guess the second question is, has there been any discussion with Sierra Space about converting Dream Chaser for crew? Thank you.
On Sierra, I will let somebody else answer that. With regard to Boeing, remember, it's a fixed price contract. We expect delivery on the contract, and therefore, there is no discussion at this point on NASA's part in the question that you pose, which is basically that they've spent X, will they spend Y to get to where Boeing Starliner becomes a regular part of our crew rotation? That's not, I don't have the answer to that, nor do I think we would have the answer now.
And I'll add about Sierra Space. Sierra's working very hard on their first maiden voyage of the Dream Chaser. That's a cargo mission. They've got the vehicle down at Kennedy and they're working through test and final assembly. So it's the plan that they fly cargo missions to station through the rest of station. And in fact, that's the scope of the contract that we have with them, to provide cargo capabilities. There is no existing contract with the agency for crewed capability, which doesn't mean that that's not a possibility somewhere in the future. In fact, Sierra has their own goals about moving in that direction in the future. But for now, the work and the focus is on getting them flying as a cargo flight. And if you look back to how we started SpaceX and the Dragons, that's a very similar approach. We started with cargo flights first. We flew a number of flights, and then they eventually evolved into the crewed version of the Dragon.
Next question is from Lauren Grush from Bloomberg.
Hi, thank you so much. I'm wondering, can you walk us through what modifications, if any, will be made to Starliner ahead of its return now that it doesn't have a crew on board? And will NASA be flying that return any differently or watching for anything specifically now that it's performing this return without a crew? Thanks.
I'll take the question relative to the reconfiguration of Starliner. There's a few things that we have to do differently. As I said earlier, we're going to modify the separation sequence a little bit to get away from the space station a little quicker than we had planned. So that's one modification. That will be done via ground commanding, and then there'll be some time-tagged events in the flight software that they'll execute. There are a few items in the cockpit that have to be configured a little differently. Obviously, if you had a crew on board, some of the life support systems will be configured just like we did on the Orbit Flight Test 2 mission in 2022. We'll use those same configurations. Obviously, we've got to do a little bit of planning relative to the center of gravity without the crew members being in the seats. So we've looked at that already, and that doesn't appear to be a big problem. So we've got a few things like that to go work on. The teams have been really laying out all that data. The ground teams will have a little bit different set of flight rules to operate from. So they'll have that ahead of them. But there's a few minor things to the spacecraft to reconfigure, and we're already in the process of starting that work.
Next question is from Will Robinson-Smith from Spaceflight Now.
Yeah, hi, thanks so much for taking the time to speak with us today. Question, I believe, for Dana Weigel, perhaps Steve Stitch. In one of the previous briefings, it was discussed that I think the Russians wanted to see, it was 1 or 2 successful full crew rotation missions of Starliner before they would put one of their cosmonauts on the spacecraft. Has the agency had the opportunity to talk to Roscosmos about the path forward and what the options will be for flying cosmonauts to and from the space station with Starliner at this point? Thank you.
Sure. Our focus with all the international partners, as you can imagine, discussions about what's happening on board or changing launches or operations on board involve not just our NASA team, but the entire international partnership. And so similar to the discussions you've heard today, the focus has been on the decision immediately in front of us with what to do with Starliner crewed or uncrewed. And in fact, when we ended the review today, I sent an email out to all of the program managers across the international partnership so they understood the decision. So they've been following along with us. In terms of Roscosmos thinking about our integrated crew exchanges and flying on the Boeing vehicle, they have always maintained that they want to see a few successful flights before they fly crew on it. I don't expect that that'll change, but we're not actively having those discussions right now. Right now, we're focused on what to do with Starliner, but of course, those are things we'll talk about in the future.
Next question from Irene Klotz at Aviation Week.
Thanks very much. I think this is for Steve. As far as the thruster issues, considering the return of the spacecraft and the performance during OFT 1 and 2, is the primary concern now that because there was the overheating during the approach to station that there's some uncertainty on how these thrusters are now going to perform during the deorbit? And can you also just give us an update on what the status is on Boeing's preparations to return Starliner without crew, and what, if any, additional risks to the spacecraft are? And granted, those are far below risk to crew, but if there are any additional risks at this point in bringing Starliner back uncrewed, since that's not the nominal plan. Thanks.
Yeah, good questions, Irene. What I would say is that the thrusters on this flight relative to Orbit Flight Test 2 have experienced higher heating. We had more thrusters fail off, more thrusters see degradation. In fact, one of them failed off, and we haven't hot fired that. We did 2 docked hot fires at ISS, and we've chosen not to utilize that thruster at all. But they've experienced a little more stress, I would say, than the previous flight. Even though the deorbit burn was successful on OFT, the first orbit flight test and the second one, these thrusters have experienced more stress, more heating, and so there's a little bit more concern for how they would perform during the deorbit burn, holding the orientation of the vehicle, and then also the maneuvers required after that. We've also learned in the starboard doghouse in particular, there is extra heating that we have just discovered in the last 2 weeks. And looking at the data a little more closely, anytime an orbital maneuvering thruster fires in that doghouse, there's higher heating. And so we had 1 thruster on OFT2 in 2022 fail off after the deorbit burn. It would not surprise me to see one of the starboard aft thrusters in that doghouse fail off in the deorbit burn for this flight. So I would say a little higher heating, a little bit more thermal, and a little more uncertainty now that we understand the physics a little bit better for a crew return. In terms of the preps of the vehicle, we've been getting the vehicle prepared. The team is on the ground, really has gone through and looked at the flight software that's on board. Is there any changes that need to be made to mission data loads? This technique of using a very simplified SEP sequence has minimized the changes required on mission data loads. They're going to take the actual software that we plan to use and put it through its paces in the facility that's a hardware software integration facility that Boeing has. The team has been doing practice runs in a training facility. When I say the team, the ground team has been doing runs just to make sure they understand the differences between the uncrewed and uncrewed. And really, I think it's, I would say, unconnecting muscle memory almost. If you've been training for 2 years to do things a certain way with the flight control team on the ground, with the crew on board, where you can make calls to the crew to do certain actions, they now have to take those actions. And so they've been doing those practices. And there's an integrated simulation next week on Wednesday with the ISS flight control team. The undock sequence is always an orchestrated series of events between how ISS gets configured, how we depress the interface between Starliner and the ISS, how we configure the guidance navigation control for the space station and the software. And so they're going to do that integrated practice next Wednesday. And we'll take our time. If that goes well, we'll pick an undock date. And if it doesn't, we need more simulations, we'll go ahead and pivot. We've laid out a schedule that allows us the opportunity to have some flexibility in Starliner undock, and that's been very important for Dana and I.
Next question is from Jeff Faust from Space News.
Good afternoon. Question for Ken Bowersox or Steve Stitch. You mentioned earlier in the briefing that it was a very close decision on deciding to bring back Starliner uncrewed. I'm wondering if you can quantify that in some way. Was there some particular piece of data or missing piece of data that really swayed that decision, that very close decision? Thank you.
So I'll give it from my point of view, the answer, and then Steve can weigh in. If you look at it, we knew going in that the crewed flight test was probably a little higher risk than a typical rotation with Dragon, where we've flown multiple flights. That's why we called it a flight test, right? We had the issues coming uphill, and that raised our risk level and our uncertainty in how much more risk there was. Anytime you change from your nominal plan that you've spent years developing, you increase risk on the other side. And the type of risks I'm talking about are something that we've analyzed for contingency return with the crew on the mid deck of the Dragon, or the necessity of sending up new suits where the crews weren't able to try out the pressure suits on the ground so that they would have suits on the Dragon. Those types of things raise your risk a little bit on that side. And so now both of your risk levels have gone up, and you knew going in that one was a little bit higher. and you've got uncertainty on just where it fits. So you have to really dig in to understand what the baseline risk change is. And that's what the team has been working so hard this last couple of months. For me, one of the really important factors is that we just don't know how much we can use the thrusters on the way back home before we encounter a problem because of the heating effects that happened on the way uphill. But Steve can tell you a lot more.
No, thanks, Ken. Yeah, I'll just mention a couple things. One, we had some thruster experts come in and talk to us a few weeks ago, and we are clearly operating this thruster at a higher temperature at times than it was designed for. I think that was a factor that, as we started to look at the data a little bit more carefully, we're operating the thruster outside of where it should be operated in. Understanding, could a thruster just fail off gracefully, or could there be another failure mode that is not so graceful? I think that was an important factor as we talked about the two differences. I mentioned the starboard doghouse, and so for some reason the heating is higher in that starboard doghouse that we do not understand. When an OMAC thruster fires, the other thrusters get heated at a much higher rate than we expected. We don't have a closed loop model to predict the performance. We worked very hard of trying to anchor a model based on what we saw at White Sands, and then knowing what you had in the uphill phase, knowing that you have a model that can replicate what we saw. Can you predict the downhill? We really just couldn't get there over the last number of weeks. Also, how close we were to a cliff. In other words, we've damaged the Teflon on some thrusters. So when we start to fire them again, will that damage repeat or get back to a point where now the thrusters are at the levels we saw on the docking day very quickly? And then really it's the consequences of failure. When we started thinking about the kind of failures we might get, we had those on docking day, and those were even though we were 200 meters from station, it's a very benign environment. This sequence, when the deorbit burn has to execute and then you get into the SEP sequence, it's a very rapid sequence from the completion of the burn to then getting into the separation a number of minutes later, and there's no real time to reconfigure. So when we laid it all out, that's where the preponderance of the risk was to not put a crew on the vehicle.
Our next question is from Manisha Ravisetti from Space.com.
Hi, thanks so much for doing this. I think my question is mostly for Dana. I was wondering, what are some of the challenges that you faced in accommodating this delay with ISS operations? I would guess that there are maybe changes you had to make with food allocation or other supplies and task division. And then relatedly, you mentioned that even with this 2025 planned return date, it is the trip is within the scope of what you're comfortable with, for astronauts traveling to the ISS. So what do you think would have been too long for this day, and the point at which we should be, I guess, worried about the fact that they're still up there? Thank you.
Let's see, for the first part of your question, just at a high level from a programmatic standpoint, we protect for about 4 months of what we call consumables reserves. So food, water, different kinds of consumables we have on board. Those are the two biggies. 4 months for 4 crew is what we protect for. So we always stay above that amount. And we do that intentionally so that if we had a problem with the delivery, a cargo flight that didn't make it, for example, we'd have margin. So we always have a little more than what we need for some period of time. It's not limitless. In this particular case, we did have a resupply mission. In fact, just a few weeks ago, the Northrop Grumman 21 flight came up. So we had our eye on that flight. And so once we realized the team was working through issues and we were likely to have Butch and Sunny on board, we changed that flight's manifest. So we added more supplies to keep us above that reserve level. We've also got the SpaceX 31 cargo flight coming up around the corner. So we've got extra supplies on that. And so we've been able to modify and adjust our cargo mission supplies to accommodate the extra mouths we're feeding. No one has had to go on a diet or calorie restrictions. So we haven't had any limitations there. In terms of duration on board, you ask an interesting question. One of the things as an agency that's really important for us is to understand the impacts of long duration space flight on the crew. And so far our experience base and that of the cosmonaut experience base is up to about 12 months, give or take. And so we understand very well performance implications and what it looks like for operations and crew health there. So you're asking the question about how long is too long. I don't think we as an agency know the answer to that. We can tell you that we understand what 12 months does. We're interested in that from Moon to Mars. And those are some of our research objectives and what we're trying to learn in the microgravity environment, but no specific concerns with 8 months or even up to a year. And so far, our data suggests that as long as we've got the right mitigations on board, exercise, the crew spends about 2.5 hours a day with cardio and weightlifting. And as long as we can keep them in shape with rigorous routines, et cetera, we've done a pretty good job keeping the crew's health up with long duration stay.
Next question is from Tim Fernholtz from Payload Space.
Thank you for taking my question this morning. I was just curious if you have any thoughts now on what might have been done to avoid this scenario after OFT2, if more attention should have been paid to redesigning a propulsion system, or if there were decisions that should have been made during the test campaign to avoid the scenario. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll take the question. I think if we look back at OFT2 now with this newer lens of what we learned at White Sands, certainly could we have explored OFT2 in a little more detail, either leading to some redesign of the doghouse to get the thermal environment lower or operate the thrusters differently. I think it's easy to do that in hindsight. If we went back and thought about the whole integrated problem a little bit more, could we have done some kind of testing? What I would say is it's very difficult to test the doghouse environment on the ground. You've got thrusters that fire in multiple directions, and it's very hard on the ground to have a test facility, a vacuum chamber that accommodates thruster firings in multiple directions. So, and then get the thermal right in that doghouse and keep the thermal up. So there was no easy way to do that test on the ground. We thought, obviously, we had done enough analysis to show that the thrusters would be within the temperatures that they were qualified for. Clearly, there were some misses back in qualification. We're going to go through that data in more detail post-flight and then figure out what we can do to go fix them. And then we'll also look at our process. I would say we're going to look at the certification process. I know Boeing's looking at their process as well on how they got here. We're doing the same thing on the NASA side.
Next question is from Sawyer Rosenstein from NASASpaceflight.com.
Hi, thank you so much for taking my question. Earlier you mentioned that there would be a simplified undocking procedure. Can you kind of explain what that means, of what this undocking would be like compared to, say, with crew, and what the contingency would be if there is an issue at some point with that undocking and burn away from the station?
Yeah, I can answer the question. So normally we would back away from the space station, essentially go out in front and then above the space station, and then eventually end up below the space station and then on a trajectory that goes beneath it and out in front of the space station. That was our normal plan to undock, heading into the flight, before the flight. Now what we're going to do is execute a small number. The undocking itself with the NASA docking system will be exactly the same. We'll use the same techniques. The software will command undocking. We'll drive a sequence of hooks. They'll open up after we've depressurized that area in between the vehicles, and then we'll undock. And there's some springs that push the vehicle away. What we'll do is we'll go through a SEP sequence that puts us on, I would say, what's called a posigrade trajectory. And so we'll end up going, essentially phasing out behind the space station to a safe distance, and then we'll get away from the space station, execute the deorbit burn. So we've used that kind of SEP sequence in the past in other vehicles. We've tested this SEP sequence. It is already in the software. It's one of the breakout sequences that are already in the software. And so what we'll do is just go command that sequence early and use that to get away more quickly. And so it's pretty simple, pretty elegant. It was a great idea by the Boeing team.
Our next question is from David Curley from Full Throttle.
Thank you very much. Steve Stitch and Bowersox. I think I heard Stitch say that White Sands testing was kind of the turning point for you. and I thought Bowersox kind of went in a little different direction there. And it seems to me that Boeing and NASA drew different conclusions from those tests. NASA believing that there were potential for losing some of the thrusters. Boeing said at the time that they got pretty close to root cause and were probably within reasonable risk to use them. So did you get to two different conclusions? And was it actually the key factor, the White Sands test, that led to this decision today? And did I hear that you're not ruling out the potential of a 4-person crew for a next Starliner flight?
So let me start with the first question. I think Steve was talking about how we process the data. I was talking about being encouraged by the fact that we had new data. Anytime you have new data, it means that you can analyze it and find out that things are proceeding well, and you can converge the team with that new data. What Steve found was maybe a little bit different, and that's why it probably sounded different how we reacted.
Yeah, I would say at White Sands, we were excited, and that was really a turning point in that we were able to replicate the loss of thrust. We simulated the uphill profile, in other words, how the thrusters fired from the launch sequence into on orbit all the way to docking. We did 2 of those uphill sequences, and then we did a number of downhills. And so we were encouraged when we saw that we could actually see thrust degradation in those downhill runs. What then was new is once we took the thruster apart and we looked at the valve on the oxidizer side, we saw this swelling on the Teflon seat, which when we talked to the vendor, Aerojet Rocketdyne, they had never seen this before in this particular thruster. And so I think that's where there was a change in the risk posture. Initially, we were somewhat excited by replicating the damage, or the degradation in the thrust. But then when we looked a little more closely, we saw this swelling on the Teflon. And then that gave us a whole new idea of the physics involved in the failure mode. And then that led us to study that failure mode a lot more in the last few weeks. Relative to the 4-person Starliner crew, we haven't really had those discussions yet. We need to get the vehicle back. We need to work through our sequence of events on what changes we'll make, both for the helium leaks and the thrusters, and then we'll make a decision on the next flight. It's a little premature to discuss that.
Next question is from David Denault from About Space Today.
Good afternoon. I'd like to see if we can get a individual consensus across the panel. We've talked about the voting. What about the risk assessment? Was it a 50-50 possibility of coming back? Was it a 75-25 decision or a 90-10 decision that Starliner would be safe?
Well, Starliner still has to come back uncrewed, right? And we believe that Starliner coming back uncrewed, although higher than the risk we'd be willing to take to put crew on it, is a reasonable thing to do to finish the test flight and gather the data that we want to gather. To give you a percentage on polling or how people feel, I think that's pretty tough to do. All I can say for sure is that when we polled today, all the people that we asked from the senior management of the different organizations that are involved with human spaceflight, they all concurred that we should have the crew come down on a different vehicle than the current Starliner.
Our next question is from Marvin Marshall from the Space Report News.
Hi, good afternoon. My question is for Administrator Nelson. I'm speaking on behalf of millions who share, the same concern. Given that SpaceX operates 4, soon to be 5 crew Dragons and 3 cargo Dragons that can resolve anomalies in days or weeks rather than, months or years, all receiving, a few billion less than Boeing. So we're just, curious, why does NASA continue to support a company, with a history like this? We get the rationale was to have 2 options to ensure, reliability and redundancy, but that's what you get with SpaceX's ability to operate multiple spacecraft, quickly address anomalies, everything they do. So again, just speaking on behalf of millions, why does NASA continue to fund Boeing?
What is your question?
Wow.
Why do we continue to fund Boeing? problems when SpaceX.
Is your question, why does NASA continue to fund Boeing?
Yes.
For the obvious reason that, number one, we need 2 spacecraft to have the redundancy in case one is not available to take crew to and from the International Space Station. Number 2, this is according to an arm's length contract, and a contract that is a fixed price contract. And number 3, Boeing has been a great partner for NASA over the years. As a matter of fact, the big Space Launch System, the SLS rocket, is overall managed by Boeing. And there has been a long history with Boeing. The 4th reason is that they were the successful bidder along with SpaceX, because we had wanted 2. So for all those reasons, that's why NASA does business with Boeing.
So I'd also like to add, Boeing operates the space station for us as well as the prime contractor for space station, and that's in its 25th year. So we have a long and storied history with them there also.
Yeah, Boeing's been a great partner with us on space station. And I think the key word is partner. A lot of people want to focus on the contractual relationship where we're buying something from a company. This isn't completely like that, right? I mean, we have a contract with Boeing, but it's to work together to develop this capability for our country. And we've had 2 good partners, Boeing and SpaceX, when it comes to commercial crew. And when they have problems, we don't just throw rocks at them or tell them that we don't like them. We work with them to get through those problems.
Our next question is from Jackie Goddard from the Times of London.
Yes, hello, thank you. And just following on from that, can you help us understand why Boeing aren't here and what we're to conclude from that? You used to brief jointly. And whatever the reason may be, was there any discussion around what their absence might communicate to the public? Boeing has been adamant that Starliner is safe. You folks aren't there. We hear that the legacies of Challenger and Columbia have helped to guide your caution at NASA. So how concerned should the public be at the implication that that learning curve at Boeing possibly differs? Thank you.
Well, I'll take the first part, and it looks like Jim's getting ready to take the second part. But the reason Boeing's not here is it was a NASA decision today, crewed, uncrewed. That was the focus of this review, and so we thought it was reasonable to have just NASA on this panel. Jim, anything you want to add?
I think that's correct, Ken. And then I'd add, I think Ken and Steve have characterized that Boeing was part of the decision process. They've characterized what Boeing's position was. So and we're here to communicate the overall NASA position.
Next question is from Natalie LaRoche from the Boston Globe.
Hi there. Thank you so much, everyone, for the answers to your questions. It was mentioned earlier that their families are their pillars of strength right now. I was just wondering how apprised their families are in this whole process, and if you could describe what their spirits are during these times.
Okay, I think if I heard your question right, it was how the families are doing and how we support the families. Again, as I said previous, families are the pillars of strength and support. Their families are doing well. Their families understand, just like the crew members when they launch, there's always an opportunity. There's always a possibility that they could be up there much longer than they anticipate. So the families understand that. I'm not saying it's not hard. It is hard. It's difficult. You have to adjust for that. We have a support structure for the astronauts, and it's there to support the families and the crew members on orbit. So they're doing well. They understand. And again, we thank them for what they do.
All right, we have time for one more question. So to close this out, the last question will be from Bill Harwood from CBS News.
Yeah, thank you very much. A question for Senator Nelson, if I can. All my technical questions were answered, so I have a political question for you. There's been a lot of talk during the past few weeks that we live in an environment today where one presidential candidate is the chairman of the National Space Council, and we live in an environment where criticism is thrown about. I don't know what word to even use for it. The question is this: is there, in your mind anyway, did politics and the ramifications of this decision, if it didn't go well, play any role at all in your decision, your personal decision, Senator, about how to proceed with this? Was politics even in the back of your mind when you guys were talking about all this? Thanks.
Bill, if anyone knows, you know that NASA is not only bipartisan, it is nonpartisan. And that's the way we've tried to operate this agency as long as I've been here. I can tell you unequivocally, from a personal standpoint, that politics has not played any part in this decision. What I said earlier about Challenger and Columbia and the lessons learned and what we've tried to change in a culture in order that safety is our North Star is what we are trying to do in a very hostile environment in which if you make a mistake, it's very unforgiving. So I can tell you unequivocally, I have seen some speculation in the press that because we are in an election season, that decisions may have been made with regard to this announced today with regard to an election. Absolutely has nothing to do with it. And as long as I'm around here, it's not going to.
Thank you, Administrator, and thank you to all of our panelists today. Thank you all for joining us. Stay tuned for more information on NASA's Commercial Crew Program blog at blogs.nasa.gov/commercial crew. Have a great afternoon.
When I tell you that is one of the most interesting news conferences that NASA has held in a very long time. So again, if you are just now sort of getting up to speed with what is going on, we have 2 astronauts that have been officially pretty much stranded in space. They are stuck in space right now. They took the Boeing Starliner up to the International Space Station. And this was a test flight, a routine test flight. And NASA stopped short of calling it a failure or mission failed, but there are things absolutely wrong with this craft that it has been deemed unsafe, essentially, for these 2 NASA astronauts to return. SpaceX is stepping in to absolutely save the day here, which I find so ironic. Very, very ironic. SpaceX is essentially knocking down its crew from 4 to 2 for its next Dragon capsule mission to ensure that Sunny and Butch have a seat to come home. Now, you heard Bill Nelson talk about, he's always been a very prevalent leader of NASA, especially in these last, few years. And you heard him talk about how Challenger and Columbia had a lot to do with his decision. Now, I happen to be someone that's actually lived in both incidents. I was around when Challenger exploded, when it was leaving Cape Canaveral, Florida. I remember it like it was yesterday. I was about 9 or so. And then as a 20-something-year-old woman, Columbia broke up upon re-entry into Earth. I happened to be from Texas, and I was in East Texas the day that happened. And I just so happened to be traveling from Dallas out to the piney woods of East Texas along I-30, along into some other back, I guess you could call them backwood highways. And I'll never forget seeing all of the helicopters flying around and all of the talk that came from people, especially people that lived around the Jasper area, of things that were being found on the ground. All those astronauts lost their life that day. And Columbia was going so fast from the moment that it went into orbit. I mean, it went from California to Texas in a moment, just so quickly, right? It's traveling so fast. And it broke up. It started to break up over California. And so how can you, if you lived through Challenger and Columbia, how could you with any conscience put 2 more lives potentially in danger on a test flight that is clearly showing leaks and thruster issues? And you heard some of the staff there talking about a piece of Teflon that is being used in the use of these thrusters that seems to be expanding in a way that's not normal, that they were not expecting. The maker of that piece of Teflon has never seen that in its current practicality and use for the Boeing Starliner. So NASA's saying better safe than sorry. And, I think they're making the right decision here. I think they're making the right decision. This formal review that happened today and this news conference, essentially it was all about, could Boeing Starliner vehicle safely return its crew? And I feel much more confident in, that SpaceX, the Dragon will be able to, they have done several trips, right, to the ISS and back, several trips. And they've got, I feel more comfortable too. And I'm sure Butch and Sunny do as well. There was a poll of NASA representatives from across the agency's departments of research, oversight, development centers, and that was a unanimous poll that they did not feel that the Boeing Starliner could bring that crew back home safely. This is a quote. "We've had mistakes done in the past. We've lost 2 space shuttles as a result of there not being a culture in which information could come forward. Spaceflight is risky, even at its safest, and even at its most routine. And a test flight by nature is neither safe nor routine," end quote. So again, SpaceX, which carries typically 4 astronauts as part of its standard crew rotation, for the next mission, Crew 9, it will be reconfigured to carry, by reducing the number of crew from 4 to 2, it will allow these 2 astronauts to be carried on board back home safely. You also heard Dana at NASA speak about how there are enough provisions for food, water, all of that good stuff. They keep a 4-month, amount of provisions on board. And there's more than enough food, water to go around. And you also heard the NASA representatives talking about how Butch and Sunny they've been doing work there's a lot of work to be done, a lot of science focused based work that is, being done, and they have been helping out. And again, these thrusters seem to be what's at question here. Not to mention there's talk of leaks, but these thrusters, these reaction control thrusters that also help the craft undock. It's amazing to me that we haven't had an accident on the International Space Station since its inception, to be honest with you. We've had crew from all over the world go into the International Space Station. There's always human error to be concerned with, and we've managed to keep the ISS still going after all these years. Again, Sunny and Butch were only expected to spend 8 days in space. And their stay is now turning into much longer. And again, they are not expected to return home until 2025 now. Listen, everyone, I appreciate each and every one of you for coming through, checking out the live stream. If you're on Twitter, make sure you subscribe to the channel, because this is the type of content I do, amongst other very interesting content. Feel free to go down the page. But man, I know Gloria's up there. I couldn't figure out a way to mod you up. I know there was an interface change on X a few months back, and we used to be able to have mods. I don't even see the live chat. Maybe that's a function I need to check if the function's enabled when I go live up there. But it is what it is. Thank you for coming up and on X to the platform. I definitely tend to have a lot of more viewers over there, especially when I'm doing live streams like this. So I appreciate each and every one of you. You all, I again will be back later on tonight where we will be talking about the recent mass UFO sightings that have happened in Palmdale, California, Lancaster, California, over a couple of day period. And I've even been hearing talk about UFO sightings, mass UFO sightings happening in Hawaii recently, right after the Palmdale, California mass UFO sightings. These were recorded by several spectators that happened to record this happening on their phones. And, I'll be back live later on to talk about that. So much love to each and every one of you. I appreciate you all for coming through. Until next time, everyone. Shout out to the LeakYou community. Please join us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, and Amazon Music.
Please hit the like. Thank you.
The judgment sentence that you are an asshole. The trial is over. Thank you, everybody.
Let's play a game. You have 10 seconds to take all your stuff and get out of my life. 10, 9, 8.
God bless you, motherfucker.
You're really smart. Like really, really, really smart like I am.